Welcome to the Dark Ledger, where history's darkest secrets are finally revealed. In 1848, Baton Rouge stood quietly along the slow, heavy curve of the Mississippi River, a city that appeared calm on the surface yet breathed fear beneath its brick streets and wooden porches. The river was the city's lifeline, carrying sugar, cotton, and wealth downstream. But it also carried silence, thick, deliberate silence. At dawn, mist rolled in from the water, wrapping the docks, warehouses, and slave pens in a pale grey shroud, as if the city itself wished to hide what it had become. Plantation owners walked confidently through the streets, their boots echoing against stone, while enslaved men and women moved with eyes lowered, backs bent, and voices restrained to whispers. Everyone knew their place, and everyone knew that survival depended on obedience, not truth. The air was heavy with the smell of molasses, sweat, damp wood, and fear, an odor so familiar that few noticed it anymore. Baton Rouge in that year was not a large city, but it was powerful. Its importance did not come from size, but from what passed through it. Sugar plantations stretched outward like dark veins, fed by forced labor and guarded by overseers who carried whips as casually as walking sticks. Slave auctions were not hidden events, they were woven into daily life, held in courtyards and market squares, where human beings were inspected like livestock. Children learned early to look away. Church bells rang on Sundays, calling white families to worship, while enslaved people listened from a distance, barred from the pews, barred from mercy, barred from justice. Faith was preached loudly, but compassion was practiced selectively. At night, the city changed. Lamps flickered weakly along the streets, casting long, warped shadows that stretched like grasping hands. Doors were locked early, shutters drawn tight. White families feared slave revolts, poisonings, or arson, rumors that traveled faster than facts. Enslaved people feared far worse. They feared being sold south without warning, feared punishment without explanation, feared being called out by name after dark. The sound of boots approaching a slave cabin at night could freeze blood in the veins. No knock was ever gentle, and no visit after sunset ever meant something good. The Mississippi River itself seemed to watch everything in silence. Barges creaked, chains clanked, and steamboat whistles cut through the night like wounded cries. Sometimes, long after midnight, the river carried sounds that were never discussed openly. Splashes too heavy to be fish, muffled cries swallowed by water, objects thrown overboard under the cover of darkness. The river had seen too much to testify. It carried secrets the way it carried cargo, steadily, endlessly, without judgment. In slave quarters on the edges of plantations near Baton Rouge, fear lived as a constant companion. Cabins were cramped, built quickly, meant to last just long enough to extract labor. Inside, families huddled close, sharing warmth, sharing grief, sharing stories that were spoken only in hushed tones. Elders warned children never to wander at night, never to ask questions, never to repeat what they heard. There were places on certain plantations where even overseers avoided after sundown, places where lantern light seemed to dim for no reason, where the ground felt softer underfoot, as if disturbed many times before. White society, on the other hand, maintained a careful performance of respectability. Dinner parties were held, business deals struck, political ambitions discussed over wine and cigars. Baton Rouge's elite spoke proudly of progress, civilization, and order. Newspapers praised economic growth and stability. Any mention of cruelty was dismissed as exaggeration or abolitionist propaganda. The system worked, they claimed, because it had to. Questioning it was seen not only as foolish, but dangerous. Those who asked too much found themselves isolated quickly, their reputations quietly destroyed. Yet beneath this polished surface, unease simmered. Plantation owners slept lightly, pistols kept near their beds. Overseers were quick to violence, driven as much by fear as by cruelty. Patrols roamed the countryside at night, stopping any enslaved person found away from their quarters without written permission. The crack of a whip was not just punishment. It was a warning, a message meant to travel far and wide. It reminded everyone that power was absolute and mercy optional. In 1848, whispers began to move through Baton Rouge like a sickness. Not the usual rumors of escape attempts or stolen food, but something darker, harder to name. Enslaved workers spoke of people who went missing without explanation, not sold, not transferred, not punished publicly. They simply vanished. No notices were posted. No questions were allowed. In a society where human beings were counted like inventory, unexplained absences should have raised alarms, but they did not. Instead, silence closed in tighter than ever. The city's geography itself seemed complicit. Dense trees surrounded certain estates, their roots twisting deep into the soil. Old storage cellars and unused buildings dotted the land, remnants of earlier years. The past was never fully erased, it was merely covered over. Rainstorms would sometimes wash away layers of dirt, revealing old foundations, broken tools, and things better left unseen, but no one lingered long enough to look closely. Curiosity in Baton Rouge was a liability. Religion offered little refuge. Ministers preached obedience to masters as God's will, quoting scripture selectively to maintain order. Enslaved people prayed in secret, blending Christian hymns with African spiritual traditions, asking for protection, for freedom, or at the very least, for understanding. Some believed the land itself was cursed, soaked with suffering so deep it could never be cleansed. Others believed the dead still walked, restless because justice had never found them in life. As 1848 progressed, the tension grew heavier. The city felt like it was holding its breath. Even those who benefited most from slavery sensed that something was wrong, though few could say exactly what. The fear was not of rebellion this time, but of exposure, of truths buried too shallow, of sins too large to remain hidden forever. Baton Rouge was prosperous, yes, but prosperity built on silence has a way of cracking under its own weight. This was the Baton Rouge into which the disturbing mystery was born. A city where power ruled openly, cruelty hid behind manners, and fear flowed as freely as the river itself. A place where disappearance was easier than explanation, where history was written by those who could afford to forget, and where the ground beneath every step carried the echoes of lives that mattered deeply, even if the world pretended they never existed. The disappearance began quietly, the way most terrible things do in places where silence is enforced. There was no announcement, no posted notice, no shouted alarm. One day, a man was present among the enslaved workers, seen hauling sacks near the river docks, moving with the slow exhaustion common to all who labored from dawn to dusk. And the next day, he was simply gone. His name was spoken soft. Lee at first, then not at all. In Baton Rouge, 1848, absence did not demand explanation when the absent person had no legal existence of their own. The system allowed bodies to appear and vanish without consequence, and so it did. Those who worked beside him noticed immediately. Enslaved communities were bound by necessity and shared suffering. Every missing face mattered. They counted each other instinctively, not on paper, but in memory. When he failed to appear at morning roll call, a quiet unease passed through the line of bowed heads. Overseers barked orders, impatient with hesitation. Someone muttered that he must have been reassigned. Someone else said he had been sold. These were explanations everyone had learned to accept, even when they made no sense. But there had been no chains rattling at dawn, no wagons prepared, no paperwork discussed openly, and yet no one dared to ask. By midday, the absence felt heavier. Work continued as always, but hands trembled slightly, eyes scanned familiar paths. The missing man had family, kin who shared his cabin, his meals, his whispered hopes of survival. They waited for news that never came. No overseer summoned them, no punishment was announced. The lack of violence, oddly, made the fear worse. In the logic of slavery, cruelty was predictable, silence was not. Among the white population, the disappearance barely registered. Plantation owners had inventories to manage, but they were flexible documents. Numbers shifted constantly due to illness, punishment, sale, or death. A missing enslaved person could be accounted for later, adjusted in ledgers with a line of ink. No one expected an explanation because none was required. The law did not ask where a slave went, only who owned them, until ownership itself dissolved into nothingness. Days passed, then weeks. The man did not return. His family began to understand what everyone else already suspected. Whatever had happened was not meant to be spoken of. In the quarters at night, whispers replaced conversation. People spoke of similar disappearances in years past, isolated, scattered, never officially acknowledged. Always the same pattern. A person noticed one day, gone the next, their absence folded into routine as if it had always been there. What made this disappearance different was how thoroughly it was ignored. Even overseers, usually eager to demonstrate control through punishment or public example, acted as if the man had never existed. His name was struck from verbal memory before it was ever struck from a ledger. Tools he once used were handed to others without comment. Space he occupied was filled immediately, as if to prevent emptiness from asking questions. Some enslaved workers believed he had attempted escape. That hope, dangerous as it was, lingered briefly. The idea that someone might have reached the river, slipped onto a boat, and vanished into the current offered a thin thread of comfort. But experienced elders knew better. Escape attempts were loud, violent affairs. They ended in blood, pursuit, and warning. This disappearance had been too clean, too deliberate. No dogs were released, no patrols scoured the roads. The silence itself was evidence. In the days that followed, fear settled into the quarters like damp air. Parents pulled children closer at night. Men avoided walking alone after sunset. Women spoke in code, finishing sentences with their eyes rather than their voices. Everyone sensed that asking the wrong question could make them next. Slavery had taught them that survival depended not only on obedience, but on selective blindness. Rumors began to circulate, though never in full sentences. Words like taken, chosen, and moved floated without anchors. Some spoke of a building near the edge of one. Plantation that was always locked, even during the day. Others mentioned wagons that traveled only at night, covered carefully, returning empty before dawn. These stories contradicted one another, but they shared a common shape. People were being removed quietly, intentionally, and permanently. White society, meanwhile, performed ignorance with practiced ease. If the disappearance was noticed at all, it was reframed as an administrative matter. Perhaps the man had been sold south. Perhaps he had died of illness and been buried quickly, as was often done. Perhaps he had been punished and transferred. These explanations were not verified because verification would require acknowledgement, and acknowledgement carried risk. It was safer, more comfortable, to let the mystery dissolve into routine. Yet not everyone was entirely at ease. A few plantation owners noticed inconsistencies, numbers that did not align, labor shortages that could not be explained by seasonal illness. They asked quiet questions of their overseers, who responded with vague assurances. Pressing further would mean confronting methods they preferred not to know about. In a system built on exploitation, there were lines even exploiters avoided crossing openly. The enslaved man's family was never informed of anything. No closure was offered, no ritual allowed. Grief, like everything else, had to be managed silently. His absence became a wound that could not be mourned publicly. In the quarters, people spoke of him in the past tense only when children were asleep. To remember too openly was to invite danger. To forget felt like betrayal. As time went on, the disappearance began to feel less like an isolated event and more like part of a pattern. Others were taken from different plantations, different owners, different tasks, always without announcement, always without record. The randomness was terrifying, because it meant no one was safe. Strength did not protect you, obedience did not protect you, being useful did not protect you. Something else was at work. Something that operated beyond the visible rules of slavery. Baton Rouge, already a city steeped in fear, grew quieter. The river docks seemed more watchful. Night sounds felt sharper, more intentional. Even white residents reported unease they could not explain, anxiety that crept in during the early hours before dawn, when the world felt thin and exposed. Some claimed to hear voices carried over the water, though they could never say what the voices said. Others dreamed of empty rooms and locked doors, waking with the sense that something had been taken from them, even if they could not name it. The disappearance was never investigated. There was no official inquiry, no church discussion, no newspaper mention. History, as it was written, left a blank space where a human life had been. That blank space was the point. It demonstrated how completely a person could be erased, not only from the present but from memory itself. For the enslaved community, the lesson was clear and devastating. If someone could vanish without consequence, then existence itself was conditional. You lived only as long as you were seen, counted, and needed. The moment you were not, you could be removed as easily as a broken tool. Fear became more than an emotion, it became a strategy for survival. Speak less, notice less, remember quietly. This was the disappearance no one dared to question, not because no one cared, but because caring was dangerous. In Baton Rouge, 1848, the greatest threat was not punishment, but erasure. And once people understood that, the mystery deepened, not because answers were impossible to find, but because the cost of seeking them was too high for anyone trapped within the system to pay as the disappearance. Settled into grim acceptance, the slave quarters became a place where sound itself was treated with suspicion. Daytime brought the expected noises of labor, hoes striking earth, carts creaking, overseers shouting, but at night, the air filled with something else, something harder to name. People spoke less, yet listened more. Every rustle outside a cabin wall, every distant footstep, every shift of wind through the trees felt deliberate. Whispers traveled low and careful, carried from mouth to ear only when faces were close enough to share breath. Words were chosen sparingly because words had weight, and weight could sink a person. Stories began to circulate, though no one ever claimed to know them firsthand. They arrived fragmented, incomplete, changing shape depending on who told them. Someone said they heard crying near the old storage cellar after midnight, a sound too controlled to be an animal and too restrained to be free. Another claimed that the ground near a certain oak tree felt hollow beneath the feet, as if the earth itself had been disturbed and never properly settled again. These were not tales meant to entertain, they were warnings, shared the way one might pass along the location of a hidden trap. The elders were the most cautious. They had lived long enough to recognize patterns, and patterns frightened them more than isolated cruelty. They remembered other plantations, other towns, other years when people vanished quietly and were never spoken of again. They spoke in proverbs and half-finished sentences, letting younger listeners draw their own conclusions. Some doors, they would say, are locked for a reason, or not every place wants to be found. Their eyes carried a heaviness that suggested knowledge earned at great cost. Children sensed the change even when they did not understand it. They were warned not to play beyond certain boundaries, not to wander near abandoned buildings, not to ask why some paths were no longer used. Games became quieter, laughter shorter. Mothers kept watch from cabin doors long after darkness fell, counting heads repeatedly, as if the act itself might protect what they loved. Fathers slept lightly, waking at the smallest disturbance, knowing that strength offered no guarantee against being taken. Among the whispered rumors was the idea that certain enslaved people were being chosen. Chosen not for punishment, not for sale, but for something else entirely. The criteria were unclear, which made the fear worse. Some believed it was those who spoke too much. Others thought it was those who spoke too little. Some said it was the young and strong. Others insisted it was the sick and expendable. Every theory contradicted another, yet all led to the same conclusion: no behavior could ensure safety. At night, when work was done and the world narrowed to the dim light of a hearthfire, people listened for sounds they could not explain. Sometimes it was the faint roll of wheels on dirt roads long after wagons should have stopped moving. Sometimes it was the distant clank of metal, too rhythmic to be chance. On certain nights the air carried a smell that did not belong, something sharp and sour, cutting through the familiar odors of smoke and sweat. No one ever named it aloud. One story, repeated in different forms across multiple plantations, spoke of a building that was never used during the day. It appeared ordinary enough, wooden, weathered, easily overlooked, but at night, faint light was said to escape through cracks in its walls. People claimed to have seen shadows moving inside, slow and purposeful. Those who walked too close felt an overwhelming urge to leave, a pressure in the chest that made breathing difficult. Whether the building truly existed in all the places it was described mattered less than the fact that people believed it did. The whispers also spoke of white women, rarely mentioned directly but present in implication. In the daylight they moved through the world with an air of refinement, their hands gloved, their voices soft. At night some believed they became something else, figures of quiet authority whose cruelty was expressed not through rage but through calm, deliberate action. These rumors were the most dangerous to repeat, and so they were shared only in the vaguest terms, often stopped midway by a look or a shake of the head. Fear changed how people remembered the past. Innocent events took on new meanings. A strange request from an overseer months earlier, a night when someone had been called away and returned shaken, a building locked more tightly than others. All these memories were re-examined through the lens of disappearance. The mind, desperate for order, tried to assemble fragments into a shape that made sense, but the shape that emerged was too frightening to hold for long. Silence became a form of protection. People learned to speak with their eyes, to communicate warnings through pauses and gestures. A sudden stillness could mean danger. A glance toward the trees could signal that someone was listening. Songs sung at night took on double meanings, their lyrics coded with references to watchfulness, endurance, and loss. Music became a way to express what could not be said, a release valve for fear that otherwise had nowhere to go. The whispers were not limited to the enslaved. Even among the white population, rumors circulated, though they wore different masks. Some spoke of trouble on certain estates, of methods best left unexamined. Others joked nervously about strange practices, dismissing them with laughter that sounded forced even to their own ears. A few claimed ignorance while taking care to be alone at night, never to stray from well-lit paths. Fear, once unleashed, does not respect boundaries. What made the whispers unbearable was their persistence. They did not fade with time, they deepened. Each new disappearance added weight, reinforcing the belief that something systematic was unfolding beyond the reach of law or morality. The absence of proof did not weaken the stories, it strengthened them. In a world where truth was dangerous, lack of evidence was itself a sign of power. Some enslaved people began to believe the land was marked, that certain places absorbed suffering and gave it back in echoes. They spoke of ancestors who warned that injustice left stains no river could wash away. Dreams became restless, filled with images of locked doors, faceless figures, and endless corridors. People woke shaking, convinced they had heard their names called in voices they did not recognize. The whispers shaped behavior in subtle ways. People avoided eye contact with overseers more than before, not out of submission, but out of fear of being noticed. Those who were skilled tried to appear less so. Those who were strong worked carefully, never drawing attention. Survival now depended not only on obedience but on invisibility. Despite the terror, a fragile sense of solidarity persisted. People watched out for one another in small ways, delaying a task so someone would not be alone, passing warnings quietly, sharing information without asking questions. Trust was rare, but it existed, forged by shared vulnerability. In a world determined to erase them, remembering each other became an act of resistance. The whispers never produced a clear answer, and perhaps that was their true power. They created an atmosphere where fear was constant, where imagination filled the gaps left by silence. The unknown became more terrifying than any single truth could have been. And so, the quarters remained a place of low voices and heavy listening, where every night felt like a test of endurance, and every morning felt like a small, temporary victory. In Baton Rouge, 1848, the whispers were not just stories. They were a reflection of a reality too dangerous to confront directly. They carried the shape of a hidden crime, the outline of a cruelty that thrived in darkness. And as long as people continued to disappear without explanation, the whispers would continue too, soft, persistent, and impossible to silence completely, no matter how tightly the world tried to close its ears. What made the truth most disturbing was not that it was completely hidden, but that it existed in plain sight, layered beneath routine and respectability so carefully that it blended into everyday life. Baton Rouge society in 1848 functioned like a well-rehearsed performance. Every role was known, every gesture practiced. Plantation houses stood proudly along tree-lined paths, their white columns gleaming in the sun, symbols of refinement and order. Inside these homes, conversations about business, culture, and morality unfolded beneath chandeliers, while outside, human suffering sustained the illusion. The crime was not concealed behind locked doors alone, it was embedded in normalcy, protected by custom, wealth, and shared interest. The system itself was the greatest shield. Slavery had already stripped enslaved people of legal identity, reducing them to property. Once a person is viewed as an object, what happens to them becomes a matter of management rather than justice. Disappearances could be explained away with vague references to illness, transfer, or discipline. No death certificates were required. No investigations demanded. The law did not ask questions because the law was designed not to hear the answers. Certain plantations became quietly known enslaved communities as places to fear, though no one could say exactly why. These estates were not the harshest by reputation, which made them more unsettling. Overseers there were calm, controlled, rarely given to public violence. Punishment, when it occurred, happened out of sight. Order was maintained not through spectacle, but through uncertainty. People learned that the absence of noise did not mean the absence of cruelty. Often, it meant the opposite. Buildings that seemed unremarkable by day took on a different presence after dark. Old storage rooms, disused kitchens, cellars built into the earth, all served practical purposes once, but now stood unused, locked, or guarded without explanation. White residents passed them daily without a second glance. To them, these structures were part of the landscape, as ordinary as fences or barns. To the enslaved, they radiated danger. The feeling was instinctive, rooted in experience rather than evidence. What made questioning impossible was the way responsibility dissolved into hierarchy. Overseers followed orders. Owners claimed ignorance. Local officials deferred to property rights. Each layer pointed upward or outward, ensuring no single person could be held accountable. Even if someone suspected wrongdoing, proving it would mean challenging not just individuals, but the entire social order. Silence was not merely encouraged, it was rewarded. There were moments when the truth almost surfaced, a ledger that did not balance, a shipment delayed without explanation, a worker reassigned abruptly to fill a space that should not have been empty. These inconsistencies were noticed, but never pursued. To pursue them would require acknowledging that something was wrong, and acknowledgement carried risk, not just to reputation, but to livelihood, alliances, and power. Among the elite there was an unspoken understanding, Some knowledge was better left untouched. Dinner conversations avoided certain topics. Eyes glanced away when someone spoke too closely to forbidden subjects. Jokes were used to deflect discomfort, laughter smoothing over unease. The shared benefit of slavery bound people together more tightly than truth ever could. As long as wealth flowed and order appeared intact, moral compromise was considered acceptable. Religion, rather than exposing the crime, helped bury it. Sermons emphasized obedience, hierarchy, and divine order. Suffering was framed as part of a larger plan, one not meant to be questioned by those at the bottom. This theological justification provided comfort to those at the top, allowing them to see themselves as righteous even while benefiting from cruelty. Faith became another layer of camouflage, turning violence into virtue through selective interpretation. The enslaved understood that the crime was not an accident or excess, but a function of the system. Whatever was happening served a purpose, economic, psychological, or both. It reinforced fear, discouraged resistance, and demonstrated absolute control. The randomness of disappearances ensured that no one could predict safety. The message was clear: your life exists at the pleasure of others, and that pleasure can change without warning. What made the crime especially insidious was how it erased its own evidence. Bodies were not left behind to testify. Witnesses were silenced through terror. Records were altered or never created. Even memory became unreliable, distorted by fear and survival instinct. Over time, people questioned their own recollections, wondering if they had imagined things that no one else would confirm. Doubt became another tool of control. Some white residents suspected more than they admitted. A few sensed that something beyond ordinary brutality was occurring. They noted changes in behavior. Overseers who avoided eye contact, owners who drank more heavily, households that seemed tense without clear reason. But suspicion without proof offered no safe path forward. Speaking out would isolate them, mark them as troublemakers, threaten their position. In a society built on complicity, conscience was a dangerous luxury. The crime's greatest protection was convenience. It was easier not to know, easier to accept vague explanations, easier to believe that disappearances were unfortunate but necessary. This ease allowed ordinary people to coexist with extraordinary cruelty. No dramatic act of evil was required, only passive acceptance, repeated daily. For the enslaved, the awareness of a hidden crime created a constant state of vigilance. They learned to read signs others missed, the way a door closed, the timing of footsteps, the sudden interest of an overseer. Survival depended on anticipating danger that could not be named openly. Knowledge was shared cautiously, in fragments. Never complete enough to incriminate anyone, but enough to warn. The land itself seemed complicit. Fields that produced wealth were fertilized with suffering. Buildings that hosted celebrations stood near places of unspeakable acts. Life went on above ground while horror unfolded just beneath it. This coexistence was the most disturbing truth of all, that extreme cruelty did not require chaos. It thrived within order. History would later struggle to explain these gaps, these silences. Records would appear clean, orderly, respectable. Names would be missing, but missing names raise questions only when someone is looking for them. Without testimony, without evidence, the crime would become rumor, then myth, then nothing at all. This erasure was not accidental, it was the final act of violence. The hidden crime of Baton Rouge was never meant to shock the world. It was designed to function quietly, efficiently, without disruption. Its success depended on invisibility, on the willingness of an entire society to look away. And in that sense, it succeeded. The most disturbing aspect was not what happened in darkness, but how comfortably it existed alongside daylight, protected by manners, law, and collective silence. By the time anyone might have been willing to confront it, there was nothing left to point to. Only absences, only fear passed down through whispers, only a feeling that something terrible had occurred and been swallowed whole by a system skilled at pretending nothing was ever wrong. By the time the mystery reached what should have been its end, there was nothing left to conclude, only what had been deliberately removed. In Baton Rouge, 1848, resolution was never the goal. Erasure was. What could not be explained was not investigated, it was absorbed into silence until it ceased to exist in any official sense. The disappearance of people left no courtroom echoes, no public reckoning, no written confessions. Instead, it left gaps, empty spaces where names should have been, moments that felt unfinished, questions that learned to suffocate themselves before reaching the tongue. Records were the first casualties. Plantation ledgers, already flexible documents, became instruments of disappearance. Names were scratched out or never written in. Numbers were adjusted to reflect productivity rather than people. A missing worker could be reclassified as sold, deceased, or transferred without evidence. These books would later be preserved as historical artifacts, praised for their neat handwriting and economic insight, while the human cost remained invisible between the lines. History would inherit the lie intact. Church records offered no refuge either. Baptisms, marriages, and burials among the enslaved were inconsistently RICO. Did, if at all. A person could live, suffer, and vanish without ever being formally acknowledged by the institutions that claimed moral authority. When sermons spoke of souls, they did not bother to count them. The mystery survived because it was never allowed to be documented in a way that demanded memory. As years passed, those who might have remembered the truth learned the cost of doing so. Overseers moved on or drank themselves into early graves. Owners died respected, their obituaries praising industry and virtue. Families inherited land, along with the silence that came with it. Each generation was taught what not to ask. Silence became tradition, passed down as carefully as property. Among the formerly enslaved who survived into later years, memory endured, but it endured in fragments. Stories were told cautiously to children and grandchildren, stripped of names and dates to avoid danger even after the fact. There was a time, elders would say, when people went missing. Not who, not why, just that it happened. Trauma does not always preserve detail. Sometimes it preserves only warning. After emancipation, when the legal structure of slavery collapsed, the mystery did not suddenly become safe to discuss. Power did not vanish, it transformed. Those who had once owned lives now controlled land, money, and law. Speaking openly about past crimes invited retaliation in new forms: economic ruin, false accusations, violence disguised as justice. The silence held. Historians who later examined Baton Rouge's records noticed odd inconsistencies: sudden drops in labor numbers, gaps in census data, references to transfers that could not be traced. But without testimony, these anomalies remained academic curiosities rather than indictments. The mystery became a footnote, then a question mark, then nothing at all. History prefers certainty, and where certainty is denied, it often chooses forgetfulness. The physical spaces where the crimes may have occurred changed, but they did not disappear. Buildings were repurposed or torn down, fields were replanted, roads were rerouted, yet people spoke of certain places with unease long after their original purpose was forgotten. Children avoided them instinctively, animals behaved strangely near them. The land remembered what documents did not. The Mississippi River continued its work, indifferent to human memory. It carried trade, floods, and generations forward, washing away traces while holding secrets in its depths. Rivers are excellent accomplices to history. They witness everything and testify to nothing. Whatever evidence might once have existed was long gone, scattered downstream, unreachable. What remained was an absence that refused to feel empty. Baton Rouge grew, modernized, reshaped itself. New buildings rose where old ones fell. Streets were renamed. Progress marched forward. Yet beneath the city's growth lingered a sense that something unresolved lay buried within it. The past was not gone, it was merely quiet. The mystery survived not as a solved crime, but as a shadow. It appeared in uneasy dreams, in stories that felt older than the teller, in moments of discomfort when certain topics arose too closely. It lived in the way some families spoke proudly of ancestry, while others could not trace theirs beyond a broken line. It lived in the silence of archives, where answers should have been. Attempts to recover the truth faced an impossible challenge. How do you prove what was designed never to be proven? How do you name victims whose names were stolen? How do you assign guilt when responsibility was deliberately dispersed across a system? The mystery resisted closure, because closure would require confronting not just individual cruelty, but collective participation. The most devastating aspect was not that the mystery remained unsolved, but that it worked exactly as intended. People disappeared, and the world adjusted. Life continued, wealth accumulated, respectability endured. The system demonstrated its power by showing that it could erase lives without leaving scars visible enough to demand healing. For descendants of the enslaved, the mystery became part of inherited grief. It explained gaps in family stories, the absence of elders who should have existed, the sense of loss without a clear source. Trauma passed down without a narrative still shapes identity. Not knowing can be as heavy as knowing. For the city itself, the mystery became a quiet wound. Unacknowledged wounds do not heal, they harden. They shape behavior, influence culture, and surface in unexpected ways. Baton Rouge carried forward with progress and pride, but the past lingered beneath its foundations, unresolved and unrepented. History often pretends that what is undocumented did not happen. But absence is not proof of innocence. In Baton Rouge 1848, the mystery was not erased by time, it was protected by it. Each passing year placed more distance between the present and the truth, making confrontation less likely, accountability more impossible, and yet, the fact that the mystery still unsettles those who learn of it suggests failure, not success. Silence can suppress truth, but it cannot destroy it entirely. It leaves traces, in fear, in rumor, in moral discomfort. The mystery endures because injustice leaves echoes, even when names and faces are gone. What history tried to erase survives in the space between records and reality, in the questions that cannot be answered, in the knowledge that something terrible occurred and was never made right. The final cruelty was not only what was done, but how thoroughly it was denied. This is where the story ends, not with justice, not with revelation, but with the understanding that some crimes were never meant to be solved. They were meant to disappear along with their victims. And the most disturbing truth of all is that, for a very long time, it worked.